In the last section, we added in a render description helper that would figure out whether or not the library was currently selected, and if it was, it would return the library's description. And that definitely had good results inside of our simulator, but you'll notice that this thing, it's kind of rough right now. We could definitely use some styling on that thing. In addition, I want to point out that our render description method right here, there's something about it that it makes me really unhappy, and that is in this tiny helper method right here that nobody is ever really going to look at, we make this very critical decision, like this statement right here, this if statement. This very critical decision where we say, if this library is currently selected, then do this thing. And so I've got this very critical logic that's just kind of tucked away inside of my component. I would feel a lot better about this component's design if we instead just passed in a single prop of something like, expanded, like this.props.expanded. And that would be either true or false, and that would determine whether or not I want to show the library's description. So what I'm saying here is it would be really nice if I could pull out this logic here, the logic to decide whether or not this component is expanded to some other location. It would just allow my component to end up being that much simpler. So I think that would be a great place to start inside this section. I want to relocate this logic right here to decide whether or not this component is selected. And so you might be asking yourself, well, Stephen, where in the world else would we do that? We can't, we could do it in the parent, but is that the best place for it? Then the parent just knows about whether or not this thing is selected. I don't know. Well, I'm going to suggest maybe the best place to do this would be in the map state to props function right here. Because this component doesn't really care about what the meaning of selected library ID is. The component just cares about whether or not it should show the expanded view. So I want to modify my map state to props function to only pass in a prop of expanded. So expanded true or expanded false. So you might be thinking, Stephen, that's not going to work. The map state to props function is only called with a state object. How are we going to know which particular library we're talking about here? Well, fortunately, what I'm really trying to lead up to here is the map state to props function is called with a second argument that by convention we call own props. This second argument here that we call own props are the props that were passed to the component that we're wrapping. So in our case, the list item component, when it is displayed on the screen by the library list, it is passed a library, right? It is passed a library, which is why inside of here we reference this.props.library. This own props function, or this own props object right here, is exactly equal to this.props inside of the component. So any props that we pass into this list item component will show up inside of map state to props as own props. And I'm sure this is a little bit confusing. Don't sweat it. This is another one of those topics that we're going to come back to many, many times. So by getting access to own props inside of map state to props, I can do some amount of kind of pre-calculation or predetermination to figure out exactly what props I want to pass down into my component. And what it really allows me to do is remove all logic from my component entirely. And that's exactly what I want to do. So inside of map state to props, I'm going to create a new variable called expanded. And expanded is going to be state.selected library ID. And if this is equal to ownprops.library.id, then expanded will be true. Otherwise, if they are not the same, expanded will be false. And then finally, instead of having to communicate to the component what the currently selected library ID is, I can just say whether or not it should be expanded. And because my key and the value are identical, I can condense this down to just expanded like so. So the net result of all this, the net result is that I have pulled some amount of logic out of my component. My component no longer has to worry about this, the meaning of selected library ID. My component can just look at this expanded flag and decide whether or not it should show the description. So now we can refactor our code inside of render description and just say, instead of looking at selected library ID, I can just look at expanded. and if expanded is true. So if expanded, then show some text, otherwise do not. And that's pretty much it. So I know that this is probably a very subtle distinction here. You might be thinking, Stephen, what is the difference between deciding inside the component itself whether or not this thing should be expanded versus placing that logic inside of map state to props? Well, yes, in this case is a very small distinction, and we probably didn't save ourselves too much by just allocating this one line of logic down to map state to props. But I can guarantee you that on more complex components, this type of consideration right here, this type of kind of pre-calculation of props to pass down to the component can be extremely helpful. So the intent here is not necessarily for our application to really save the day or anything like that. The intent here is to just let you know that your map state to props function is called with the component's props, and you can use that to do some type of pre-calculation here. Okay, let's do one last test, make sure this all works. So I'll refresh my simulator, and yep, I can still hide or show all my descriptions. So I think that the last thing we have to do is make sure that these text descriptions are styled a little bit more nicely. So let's take care of that in the next section.